this portion with just some quick introductions. Who are you? Which church or organization do you represent, and what does your church or organization do to serve the vulnerable, refugees, or immigrants? Okay.
I'm Susie Fikse, and I'm the director of Hope for San Diego, which really is a bridge from churches to nonprofits in our community. So we represent about 11 churches and 11 nonprofits in the areas of homelessness, sex trafficking, at-risk youth, and refugees and immigrants. So we're partners with Global Live to do that.
Hi, I'm Mike McClenahan. I've got one more month of being the senior pastor at Solana Beach Presbyterian Church, and then my wife and I are retiring, moving to Glendale, back home. World Relief, we've been connected in a variety of ways, but our church has a Spanish-speaking congregation. That is, their members are our members. We've had a tutoring program since the mid-90s, tutoring about 250 kids through a nonprofit called Casa de Amistad. We started an immigration center about 7 or 8 years ago that has helped about 200 or more people become citizens, plus DACA, plus green cards, and then welcomed a lot of refugee families from all over the world. And I think that's it.
My name is Moreles. I am the senior pastor for the English congregation at Church of the Nazarene in Mid-City. At Mid-City, we are a multi-congregational, multicultural church. We're also a public services hub for refugees, communities, and migrants in City Heights. City Heights is one of the most diverse city in San Diego, with over 70 languages being spoken there. We have the most diverse high school in the country. So our church is dedicated to serve these communities. We have a dental clinic, medical clinic, we have a public grocery market, a food distribution program where we feed about over 1,000 people a month. We also provide emergency sheltering services for refugees. Last year we got to provide emergency shelter for 70 refugees on a daily basis for about 3-4 months. And we work with World Relief different ways. When we opened the emergency shelter, they were there to help us provide resources and case management services. They also provide English classes. The ESL program is there at the church, and legal services and case management services, especially with our Haitian congregation. We have probably one of the biggest Haitian church communities in San Diego too, and we have a lot of services there. So thank you, everyone.
Hi, I'm Dave Schupack. I'm the founder and director of Bridge Builders Network. We have a center in El Cajon. Our focus is about building bridges between Muslims and Christians because we just know that a lot of the problems, there's a lot of misunderstanding on both sides. And so in the last 9 years or so, we've ended up working with refugees from different countries like Syria. And right now, and in the past 3 years, we've been focused on helping Afghans. And Afghans have come in very different statuses, and we're also working with the most vulnerable. They're the ones that kind of fall through the cracks.
Great, thank you. So for each of you, how did you or your organization or your church, how did God connect you with World Relief, and what does that relationship look like?
You're gonna make me start every time. So it really was a personal journey for me. When we lived in Atlanta, I probably had a very much more conservative bent, and definitely, as Matt says, did not get my information about immigration from the Bible, and really a clear understanding of why we should care about immigrants and strangers. And so I slowly was introduced to that idea and to personal stories in Atlanta. And then when we came here, I was like, where's World Relief? This is the busiest border city. And so as we were shaping Hope for San Diego about 10 years ago, like, where's World Relief? And so just started conversations to try to, bring people together around this and help kind of establish a relationship with World Relief in Southern California. And then Jane started in 2020, so, and Hope for San Diego has helped fund that effort over the years.
Can you repeat the question, Jane?
I was asking, how did God connect you with World Relief, and what
Yes.
does that relationship look like?
Got it. Yeah. So last year when we opened an emergency shelter, as many of you know, there was a border wall crisis at the end of 2 years ago, it was, and there was a welcoming center that opened right across the street of our church, and this welcoming center was the place where refugees and migrants were arriving, and we had sometimes over 1,500 refugees arriving across the street. So one day, one of the representatives came to our church, just across the street, knocked on the door and said, "We need help. Can you guys help? We see that you guys have a lot of things going on here. How can you guys help?" So we said, "We have the space to help you shelter these people." And Yeah.
So for people that didn't have the finances to pay for overnight shelter, they were just on the street. And Mid-City Church happened to be right across the street and decided they were going to open their doors and shelter people overnight in their church and actually provide dinner and showers.
We did. So when we said yes to that knock on the door, one of the main things that the team did is we immediately began to look for partners in the community. Within the denomination, with other programs in City Heights, and World Relief was one of the programs that right away jumped in. And I was not that familiar with World Relief, but learned about their awesome services. And since then, we've been partners, and they provide services on a weekly basis at our building.
Okay, so the question is, what is your organization or church's relationship with World Relief? The main way we connect with World Relief, we go back and forth, is we have sent them or asked them or informed them about families that were really in serious situation, didn't have a place to live. And many of these families have been housed by World Relief,
I'd love to hear from you guys about what, yes.
So this is a much longer story. If anybody wants to talk on the phone, I've written about it, and so I'll try to keep it as brief as possible. In 2013, some more politically conservative members of our congregation, 2 men, were asking the question about how did the immigration laws impact our immigrant members and the children that we were tutoring. And one of them was a Japanese immigrant who was raised at Manzanar, at the detention place. And they began a conversation with 2 of our associate pastors, with English-speaking and Spanish-speaking members of our church, and they shared their immigration stories, and they read Matt Soren's book, Welcoming the Stranger. And they came to me after a while and said, "We want you to talk about immigration." And we were in the middle of a building campaign. Do I have to say more? And right on these chairs instead of cozy pews, and already got a complaint a week about something. And I said, "No, I'm not going to do that. And I don't feel equipped to do it." And they said, "Well, what if you brought someone to preach who you trusted?" And I said, "Well, like who?" They said, "Dr. Mal from Fuller Seminary." I said, "He was my professor." "Yeah, we know." "Well, yeah, I would trust him." "Good, because we've already asked him." And so he came and preached on Psalm 146, that God hears the voice of the vulnerable, and we should too. And that same day, Pedro, who had grown up in our church, became a Christian at 18. Mom sent for him when he was 9 years old from Mexico to be reunited with her. Nobody knew that he was undocumented, and he was getting his master's degree from Bethel. He couldn't complete it until he got his documentation. So some people in our church helped him get his DACA. And so he told his story in front of the congregation before Dr. Mount preached, and I was standing in the back of the room, arms crossed, thinking this could go so badly. And at both services, people erupted in applause. And I realized that we were for Pedro. We were for people. This is not just a political issue. So after that, anyway, a series of events. Anyway, I was sort of a reluctant advocate. And I realized that our children that we were tutoring, 250 of them from the community, we wanted to be a safe place for them. They were suffering physical stress for fear of their parents' deportation. And so how can I be a voice for the vulnerable that God called us to be? So I just kept saying yes, which led to a visit to the White House to meet with President Obama and other leaders from the National Association of Evangelicals, etc. And Matt Sorens became just a mentor, friend. And then we've had him at our church many times. And I found as a pastor, so then that same year, our session decided to start an immigration center. Because we've been talking about posturing toward our neighbors in a way that would bless them. How do we love our neighbors? What are their needs? They want English classes, citizenship, etc. How can we be the safe neighbor to them? So we began Department of Justice training of legal counselors through World Relief, Southern California. It was up in Orange County at the time. And so World Relief became a partner for our organization that's now called Pathways to Citizenship. And so we've had Matt, 4 times. We've had great gatherings. And I think what World Relief has helped us to do is to take this great balanced biblical material and provide a forum for people to come and learn, because there's so many defenses. And if we can provide a space where people can learn together, and Matt is so, Midwest nice, right? So that's what it's been. And over the years, I've had a chance to tell our story in a variety of settings, seminars, panels like this, and I've just decided I would say yes whenever I'm asked, because it's never something I ever thought was going to be part of my story. So.
I'd love to dig in a little more and hear from each of you what it's been like for you to lead your churches and your organizations to serve the vulnerable in this season in the church, but particularly refugees and immigrants, and how you've navigated that.
See, you make me go first. Okay, you go.
All right, so just to continue our story, I would say that from the very beginning, people were sensitive to me being political. We're not a political church. We don't talk about things. And as Presbyterians who come out of kind of West Coast, more evangelical Presbyterians, we sort of separate those things out, don't talk about it. One story, 2 years after we had started all this, we have small groups in our church, sermon-based small groups. So whatever I talk about from the pulpit, they talk about the next week with the curriculum. And so I got a phone call from one of the small group leaders saying, our small group is really upset because of what you said on Sunday. I said, wow, okay, can we have coffee? We had coffee. I said, what did they say? And he started telling me, he said, I would love to meet with them personally and just find out a little bit more. So that week, I met with them and said, would you just go around the circle and tell me, what did I say that was offensive? Because I think I prefaced my comments in my sermon by saying, I don't want to be political here. I want us to love our neighbor. So what is it that I said? And we went around the circle. Half the people had not been to the sermon, but they heard I talked about immigration, and they were mad. The other people went on to be way more political in their comments than I was. And so I reflected that back to them, and I had the clerk of session with me there just support. And actually the person who was a small group leader, his name was Bob. Bob was the one who actually welcomed a retired Cuban Presbyterian pastor turned professor at Northwestern University who came to our community wanting to serve migrants in the mid-'80s. And Bob was the president of that nonprofit. And I said, it's really not my fault. Bob started this whole thing because he had a heart for the poor and for the vulnerable. And Bob's like, Me? No, really, this is the story of our church. So I would say one of the things I've learned to do is try to tap into what is the story of our church? Not my story, my leadership. What have we as a session decided? What have we committed to over the years? So if we are tutoring 250 children, if we have all of these families who are in our neighborhood, if we're called to love our neighbor, well then what's the next faithful step for us? But I've taken a lot of hits. I'm sure people have left our church. I'm sure they have. And, but it's also given us an opportunity for people, for their hearts to be softened. And to be part of doing something, not just thinking something. Doing something for kids like Pedro, for whom it makes a world of difference. So I think it's brought a lot of heartache and challenge, and important to lead with the session, with my leadership, to make sure it's our story, what we are doing, not what Mike is off on and doing by himself.
I'm ready now. So I want to tell you two quick stories because I think we've had a little bit of different experience. It's not like pastors are getting up and preaching about immigration in most of the churches that I work with, but we have had individuals meet individuals and hear their stories. And I would say that's what's been most transformational. Back in 2016, when there was a huge influx of Syrian refugees coming in, there's so many misconceptions, right? And it can be scary just because it's like this, the big other, of somebody who doesn't look like me, who's coming from this war-torn country. But a woman in the church, Beth, organized dinners. And it started as a way to help the family just economically, because the wife was an amazing cook. And so we'd do dinners in homes. We'd sit on the floor and eat amazing Syrian food, and they would tell their story. What was his name? Mihir and Yahya. And he was tortured in a Syrian prison and told his story. That was just a harrowing escape, and it was amazing and heartbreaking. And suddenly it became not this issue, but this person that I met. This other story, I don't even know if you've heard this yet. Last week I got this amazing email saying, we want to start a Good Neighbor team. And who is it but this couple who, was it 2022 when the Afghans were coming in? Yeah. 2022. This couple said, we want to help. And we kind of threw together, it was chaotic because they're all flooding in. We put together this Good Neighbor team, and they helped an extended family. Mustafa and Taz was his brother, and their parents. And so so many people rallied around to help this family. Taz and Mustafa had both worked for the Afghan, the United States presence in Afghanistan, so they were uniquely at risk and were evacuated here. The email I got last week was the same couple saying that they wanted to do another Good Neighbor team with Taz and his wife Neil and their new baby because he wants to give back. They're thriving in this community and they want to give back and help another Afghan family. So this is beautiful. Yeah.
I am blessed to serve with a team and in a church that has a heart for City Heights and a heart for what's going on in City Heights. So a lot of the people that are at Mid-City are passionate about issues connected serving the vulnerable and the marginalized. So it's been, for us, a lot of what has been going on and what continues to happen has been conversations of how do we continue to organize to make sure that our people that are coming here, our neighbors that are coming to our building can feel safe as they come and receive services, and also as they come and worship. And before I continue, I do want to say that I have two team members here with me. My beautiful wife, Victoria, who is in the back. She's the building distribution, and also Pastor Alisa in the back, who was the lead at the shelter, and also she's the lead at the grocery market, and she's also a worship pastor. So yeah, we have a beautiful team that is always thinking about these things, like how do we make sure that this community is safe, and we maintain this place sacred. This is a place where refugees, migrants are coming to seek God, and also to get what they need in order to continue, living their life. And at the moment, right now, one of the ministries that we are working on, and we continue to innovate and learn how to best implement it in our church, is what we call the Safeguard Ministry. And the Safeguard Ministry, what it is different members from the English congregation at the Mid-City have come together to provide, we can say, like an ushering ministry, where they are outside the building and they're making sure that they're keeping eyes on what's going on with the street. And one of the reasons is because we have heard of possible raids coming to City Heights. So one of the things that broke our hearts as pastors is that we are aware of several families that are no longer coming to church because they're just afraid that the ICE might show up, and with everything going on in the news and some groups being targeted, people are just scared. And so with that, working with the other pastors, we organize came together, and we have different members of the church that are standing outside, and we provide an emergency training if ICE was to come to the church. What we will do, we have a plan, an emergency plan. We have contact with the lawyer and all kinds of things to make sure that we keep the community safe, and we do have a pretty strong protective approach as a team. And I think we all are on the same page. We communicate to the community, and also we do everything in our power for the church to know and the people to know that we are for them, and we want to protect them, and we want to keep them safe. So that's what we're doing.
Well, one of the things we appreciate about World Relief is that I remember when Jane was coming to us and moving into that position of starting the office here, and we just all realized that it's real. We need a lot more people reaching out to refugees, in the city and the county. And I'm thankful that World Relief can make a lot of contacts. We make contacts with churches too, but World Relief has a great name and history, and I appreciate that more and more churches and individuals are becoming aware that, as Lou said, they're real people. These are real people. And so, going back to what Matt Sorens was saying about how so many Christians get their information, their perspective about refugees from the media, the greatest impact is to actually for somebody to meet a refugee. Or a lot of people, when they come to our center, even if there isn't a refugee in there, they say, "Oh, now I understand what you're doing." But if you can attend a dinner with them, or invite them for a meal, that's just really helpful. I've learned that our abilities as an organization, as a church, are finite. We can only do so much. And in that sense, it's frustrating. But we also have learned that God answers prayer. So we've seen a lot of prayers answered and great things happening. And we don't see things in black and white, like to look for results today, but we know we're sowing seeds, and God's working in our midst. And whoever joins, whoever starts reaching out, we hear of stories of people that are not related to a church necessarily. They just happen to meet a refugee, and they take them in, and that refugee really thrives. When we were working with Syrians, we had an event to recognize 5 of the most successful stories of Syrians that have come, it's like after 2.5 years, and Yakin's family was one of them. And I realized, so they're really powerful stories about how Christians have reached out to them in churches. And I realized, I looked at all 4 of them, and I thought, they've all been very much kind of adopted by an individual family, spent a lot of time with them. So there's just a lot of power and influence that we can have on refugees. It's also learned it's really hard work. It's not easy. One of the biggest things we've learned is that Americans, we work on schedules, right? We have a appointments. You know, I can meet you at 1:15 and then I have another appointment at 2 or something like that. People that come from the Eastern cultures, relationships is the most important value to them. And so they don't necessarily watch the clock, and they don't, if the church says, well, we want to do something on Saturday mornings from 8 till 12, well, that's great, but the refugees have problems and have needs like not according to our schedules, so we have to be flexible, right? Yeah, so a lot of things to learn. You know, it's obvious that this is God's heart. God's heart is for the refugees, and so whenever we are cooperating with God or attempting to do His will, we find that God's working and God supports us and God enables us and actually empowers us to do what we never thought we could do or even thought about doing.
I forgot to say that we are working with Grant on Knows Your Rights legal training at our church, and we're going to have a few of those also happening at the city, which is very helpful.
One of the reasons that we gathered these 4 partners to share is really because these 4 are really being intentional about how they're stewarding what God's given them. Whether it's their building, the church building that they have, the relationships that they already have in the community, the relationships that they have with other organizations, and so it's been really encouraging for me to see that. The way that Susie has used, they have a gymnasium that they've used to do these massive donation drives. Like, I mean, guys, it was like a warehouse. They converted this whole. It wasn't intentional. It just was. After the Afghan crisis, it was like all of a sudden all hands on deck, and they're like, we're going to use the space that we have. We have the gymnasium. It's not in great, shape, but you can use it. And so we did a massive donation drive, and it was serving such felt needs. And for Mike, I mean, they're in Solana Beach, and God had already built relationships into their community, and it was like, how can we not? Because of the love that we have for our friends, our brothers and sisters in Christ. How can we not engage in meeting their immigration needs, meeting after-school tutoring needs? And it was like so tangible because they had the space, and so the church was like, we're going to tutor. We're going to open up our church, and we're going to offer immigration legal services for our friends and community members. And we're going to offer tutoring because their parents don't speak English. And this is a felt need for our community. And for Luis, their church building is just like a beehive. It is like a hub. They have Point Loma that's doing medical services there for free. Dental services for the community. They've got a shower ministry. They've got a food pantry. They've got the food bank. We've got immigration legal services. We have case management there. We're doing English classes, and we're doing job readiness classes, and they're like, we have the building. If you can provide, then let's all kind of join forces and band together and see how we can meet the needs of the people here in this community, and even address some of the barriers in terms of transportation, And so, like, they've all thought very creatively, and David has this amazing community center that's on El Cajon, and it is also just this like a hub for Syrians, for Afghans. They're doing driving classes for women. They're doing English classes, sewing groups, tutoring. I mean, there's always something happening every day, but it's an opportunity for people in the community to jump in. And World Relief does, we do good neighbor teams, and so for a lot of churches, they're like, that's a big jump, because I don't have cross-cultural experience. I wasn't a missionary. I'm just a regular person. And so for, tutoring centers, it's like an easier way, or cafe English classes. It's like a first step into God's heart for the nations, especially as we're kind of shepherding and discipling our congregations to think just about the opportunity that's here now. And I know for me, I've had just so many unique experiences of meeting people that are from unreached people groups that missionaries have been trying to reach forever. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what an opportunity, because they're asking for help with everything, English, housing, navigating transportation, you know. And so I've seen that unique opportunity myself. And I've loved seeing the creativity that churches have and organizations have used to think like, God, what are you calling me to right now here in my neighborhood? What can we do? How can we serve our literal neighbors? I wanted to just share just one little piece too, even for my journey. I grew up in a PCA church in West Philly, Korean PCA church, and all our pastors were from Westminster. And our church was literally next to the projects. But we were commuting in from an affluent, predominantly white suburb. But every Sunday, we were at our Korean immigrant church that was shared with a Cambodian church, but literally next to the projects. And I actually never saw our church engage with our literal neighbors, which is why God led me into this field, because I saw this gap between our theology and our praxis. And that's what led me to Fuller, because I was like, how can this exist? How can we be preaching about it and not teach our church members, believers, how to practically live it out in such simple ways, you know? So I encourage you guys to really think about that, and we would love to walk alongside you guys as we think through that. I would love to hear from you guys before we go to Q&A. What is a word of encouragement that you have for churches that are considering tackling this very tricky topic? What's a word that you have for them?
I would just say, you know, we can put these examples like Mike and Solana Beach Pres, and it's like, wow, you dove in. And for most churches, it's too much, especially because the leader, you know, if the leader, the pastor, is not 100% all in, you can feel like, what do we do? But I think there are lots of small entry points for people that don't require the whole church to like jump in on immigration. And so it could be organizing a meal. It could be we've organized just a group of leaders to go down to Whiskey 8 near the wall and just hear the stories, what's going on, the realities at the border. It could be forming a good neighbor team, just asking, does anyone want to tutor and have conversational English at the ESL Center? And so I guess I would just say, everybody can do something, and like Jane said, we can be creative about what God's given us and where we are. Proximity-wise, churches in North County are going to do it differently than churches down here, and that's okay. And that's why we're the body of Christ, because we all have a part to play. And so I guess I would just say don't be intimidated. And also, this is such a complex issue, and we can be really afraid to tackle it. And I would just say, there are ways to talk about this, as Matt does so well, that are rooted in biblical theology, and people will think it's political, but you can talk about it in ways that are not political and that really emphasize just caring for the people that God has placed in our midst, and regardless of their status or how they came here.
I'd say get in touch with your own story. I grew up in a church that had Cuban refugees as part of our Presbyterian church. I didn't understand as a 5-year-old, but they shaped my understanding of the church, Spanish-speaking congregation with Mexican and Cuban refugees. I was a Spanish major at UCLA. That matters. We've been building houses in Mexico for 35 years across the border. God's been softening my heart, and so I think us understanding our own stories, because God gives each of us a passion for something, and there's a reason why we care. There's a reason why you showed up today. Not everybody showed up. So what is that? And to keep it in your head as just something intellectual, like we ought to be doing this, well, this is what the Bible says. Yeah, but that's not why you're here. And that's not why God would be using your church. And then the story of your church. What is the story of your church? Where are you located? Like City Heights, well, yeah. So that makes sense. Like, let's own where we are. So welcome back to the neighborhood is something that we were struggling with. And how do we posture ourselves to our neighbors? So as I think about my own story, I was also think when I was invited to participate in all this, I had my first grandchild. Aiden is now just turned 13. He was 2 years old. And I got to thinking about these children that were suffering for fear of their parents' deportation. You know, at no fault of their own, they're wondering whether or not they're going to come home to an empty house. This is a real threat right now. And so it occurred to me, this phrase, we live in the church by covenant relationships. We are family to one another. So those children are not just their children, they're our children. And if that's true, then what would I do differently? And so I began to think of them. Whenever I was asked to do something like this, I thought, okay, what would I do for my grandchildren? What would I do for the children of our church that we're tutoring? What would I do for Pedro? And connecting my own heart, my own broken heart for those situations, so that whenever I went, like today, we're telling our stories, we have to, like, this is who we are. This is how God has shaped us. So the last thing I would say is just what Susie said. We can't do everything, and we're not meant to as the body of Christ. But we can all do something. And that one thing that you're doing, you have no idea what that leads to. The tutoring program that has 250 kids started out with our Hispanic pastor, Galdino Don Juan, sitting down with 3 students at a kitchen table in 1997 because he entered into the neighborhood and found out what are your needs, and the parents were like, we can't help our kids. And one of those girls sitting at the table is now on staff as one of the directors of the Casa de Amistad tutoring. And she tells her own story. You have no idea what you're doing, that one thing that you do that turns into something bigger. And that's true for all of our stories. So sometimes when you hear people talk like this, I can never do that. Last thing, I was speaking at a conference and a guy came from Yakima, Washington, and he said, we came to hear what you're doing, Pastor Mike, but we could never do what you're doing. He said, well, what are you doing? He said, well, we're tutoring kids, this church, the school across the street. I said, well, that's awesome. Yeah, but he said, well, we could never do an immigration center. Just no, we couldn't do that. I said, okay, great. So he came back to another conference I did that next summer, and he brought with him 6 members of the Hispanic congregation, Hispanic pastor, a couple other members, and Whitworth translated the whole thing just for them in Spanish, our week-long seminar that we did. And I said, so we've been talking all this week about what this is like, but what's it like for you who are members of their church in Spanish speaking? And this one woman says, well, my daughter's with me here, she's had leukemia. And Mr. Jake, who was the guy who said he couldn't do anything, Mr. Jake took me to the hospital for her. And when it said, next of kin, what do I put? And Mr. Jake said, put my name there. So, and now she's bawling, right? And her daughter's there. And so I said, well, Jake, give us an update. What's going on in church? He said, well, this last year was the inauguration. And the day after the inauguration, this was a few years ago, about 8 years ago. The day after the inauguration, the kids across the street that we were tutoring, the principal called us and said, kids are freaking out. They're afraid they're going to be deported. Their parents are going to be deported. Would you send your people over to the school to help comfort our kids? So they did. And when they went there, they said, well, what else can we do? So here they are being with the kids. They're entering into the neighborhood. What can we do with these kids that we already love? And the principal said, I'll tell you what else you could do. There's an immigration center in town that is overwhelmed. They need money and volunteers. And Mr. Jake says, we have money and we have volunteers. So now our church is partnering with the immigration center. I'm like, okay, so all we do is take that one step of like, this is what God's calling us to do, and then see what happens, what's right for our church in our context, with our people, with our gifts, with our passion. So that's my encouragement.
Like it has been said, I do want to highlight how big the impact it is for people. The churches, and I say this as a migrant myself, and I'll share bit of my story. I am a migrant from Mexico City, from Tijuana, Mexico, and migrated here in 2001, and 2 weeks prior to 9/11, I arrived here, and in 2010, ICE arrived at my house, and I was separated from my family. I was arrested, deported, and spent a year separated from my family, from my church, from my community, and for what I call home. And long story short, now I'm here as a U.S. citizen, living in this beautiful community, and I am so grateful for the many churches, pastors that helped my mom, helped my dad, helped my family as we were struggling through all of this, and I'm a fruit of that labor that the church did and the ways in which they supported my family. I became a U.S. citizen through the grace and through the support of a pastor that was willing to sponsor me, and when I became a resident prior to becoming a U.S. citizen. So just want to say that everything we do as a community of faith for people that are in need of these things really goes a long way. I also want to say, as all of us here as leaders and pastors, to really, as we think about what can we do, how can we respond, I know it can be overwhelming, but we really need to begin by asking, what is the gospel? What is the kingdom of God? What does it mean to preach good news, not only with our mouth, not only with our theology and our services, but also with our resources and our building? What does it mean to be a community that shines, in a place where there is need? What does it mean to be a community that welcomes and people can come and know that they will find, some kind of comfort, some kind of resource that they have and that they need? And I think in a practical way, what I will encourage you all is to discern this question: what does it mean to continue preaching the good news in wider ways here in our community through our resources? Is one of the things that we realize that our church is, we have a pretty okay building. It's not that big, but it's pretty big. And we realize how many rooms were not being used well, and how many spaces could become, a place where we can provide some kind of service. So as we think about what can we do? Even I just want to remind you, even a small room that you open up for a nonprofit, a case manager, a lawyer, anything that you are able to do with your space and your resources goes a long way. And I know we have space, and I know we have resources. So again, this is the question that I encourage you to ask yourself: how can we use this space, to be a kingdom of God, to continue to be an extension of our good news, but also to use it for the well-being of these people?
Well, a lot of things come to mind I want to talk about, so I'll be brief. But a lot of the folks that work with us as volunteers, they come from churches, and if you talk to missionaries overseas, a lot of times they'll say, my church doesn't understand what I'm doing, But it's the same thing with, so if you, what I would encourage you to do, because I started out trying to mobilize churches, and I learned very quickly that churches like yours don't exist hardly ever, not that pastors would disagree with reaching out to refugees, but their plates are full and it's not on their agenda. So we have kind of been there to collect those from churches that want to get involved with Muslims or refugees, but their church isn't at the point yet. But they go back and end up influencing their church leadership, hopefully to get the church involved, which does happen. So what will happen if your church were to get involved with refugees? First thing I'd say is God will meet you. Second thing I would say that there's a lot of learning going to go on, and a lot of learning about culture. You start seeing things in the Bible that you didn't see before, and you will be. It's a challenging thing. You'll be challenged if you want. None of you want the easy path, but it can be very difficult. But people will be watching you, and you will actually be modeling. And God just uses ordinary people. We don't have to be superstars or great theologians to love our neighbor. I really think that the core foundation or approach or methodology to missions is just loving our neighbors. You know, we send people overseas, just start loving them, and the reality is that, you know, if they don't know Jesus, they don't know real love, and so they can have opportunity at least to interact with people who really love them.
I have just one final question before we go to Q&A. I'd love to hear, because we're all in different parts of San Diego County. I'm in North County, and we're also here in Claremont. Susie's in North Park, right? And then you guys are in Solana Beach, Mid-City, City Heights area, and then El Cajon. I'm curious what the impact has been in your community, in your neighborhood, with immigration policies and executive orders. So feel free to think about that for a moment. I'll share personally, we have a friend who is an Afghan Christian, asylum seeker, and he has family. They came over for dinner this week, and they said, we're fearful because we get mistaken for being Mexican. And so the wife is actually very afraid of leaving their home. And her husband's going to work. He just got a job. She's fearful for him going to work. And so she doesn't go for walks outside. She stays indoors. And she actually shared that their church said, you're fine. It's not going to affect you. But we have seen raids in North County, just in regular neighborhoods, outside of churches. And so we're seeing those very real impacts in our community. Really for me for the first time, and I will be completely honest, I've never seen myself as an immigrant until I got into this field of work, because I was born here. But I'm understanding more and more about what my new friends and our clients are experiencing. The more that I build a relationship with them and praying for them, and we're serving them, and we're hearing their very real stories and experiences of the impacts of these policies.
So our office is in North Park. We work with churches and nonprofits all over San Diego. But I'll just share a story I heard last night from a pastor who has a church in the Logan Heights area. And he was saying 6 months ago, the federal government was busing people in from the border and just dropping them off in the parks and at the transit stations. And within a span of a few months now, the federal government is driving around, rounding them up to deport them. And it's just very disorienting, and it's very scary, and there's a lot of misinformation among that community, and there's a lot of fear. Kids aren't going to school. There's ICE bans, and they remember this from, the community remembers from 4 or 5 years ago, this is what happened. And so it's very disruptive to the community and very disruptive to the good things that are happening in the community, like kids going to school, kids going to tutoring.
Yeah, fear is the biggest word to describe the Afghans, even those who are just about in the process. It takes months or sometimes years to go through the asylum process to be approved. There's just a lot of misinformation. Refugees, one of the frustrations I have is refugees tend to, when they have questions about what to do something or where to go, they tend to ask each other instead of asking us that we grew up here, And so a lot of times they don't get the best information, and so there's just a lot of fear. Last night we had a lawyer come, and an immigration lawyer, and talk to some families. So that's another thing we do. We've been involved in connecting those that have come over illegally, and those that have come over legally. Immigration is a really big thing for them, and that's also a fear. And another fear that Afghans have is their family back home, because those that have worked with the U.S. government in Afghanistan or the old Afghan government, they're hunted down. So our friends here have families that are in hiding back in Afghanistan, and all the reports say that there's thousands more of Afghans that really should be coming here that have worked with our government and overseas and have been promised that they could come to the U.S.
As I shared earlier, there's a lot of fear in our community as well, and some families not being able, just feeling safe to come and worship. One particular example is a separated concern, but a brother, a member of the church, a Haitian asylum seeker. He's been with us probably for about a year, and he arrived here by himself and with the goal of bringing his wife and his 2 children with him. So his case was going really well. He was moving forward, and then just like last week, his case got paused, and just to know the pain and to see the ways in which he has really tried everything in his power, everything he can to follow, to do what he needs to do in order for his family to be safe. All of that, is falling apart for him. And I think right now we are pastoring some of these members that really just are in this place of not knowing what's going to happen. And I think, so you can imagine how difficult that can be. And but fear, I think it is the word, and insecurity, and also the question, am I going to have to return to my town, to home, where there's gangs, where there's this happening, where there's the other thing happening, and it's just, it's scary.
I don't have specific. I know that ICE has come to Solana Beach, and I know that some people have been detained. But we are in Pathways put on a series of events that came to talk to our session about know your rights, because I think we're at risk as a church, and we're responsible as a session to monitor the risk factor of our church. And if someone were to come on our campus while we're all there, how are we going to respond? So I wanted more information. So we actually been doing Know Your Rights. They have been doing Know Your Rights seminars for affected populations and for community leaders, so that we can all know. And just to say, this topic of immigration is so much more complicated. It feels like we're all in a children's coloring book instead of an academic book that's this thick. Right, you know what I'm saying? Right now, in the media, the way we talk about it, right, wrong, this, that, in, out. In 2013, when I went to the White House, it was because the Senate had passed a bipartisan bill with a gang of 8. Now it seems so quaint. Think of Marco Rubio and Dick Durbin being on the same team. And it was ready for the House to pass. And that's why I went to the White House. And it didn't pass because the Republican House didn't bring it to the floor. There's been an inability, a lack of will from our government to actually solve the problem that the majority of Americans and majority of politicians know how to solve. It's not rocket science. They know what to do. And what World Relief is doing is supporting those values from the very beginning, supporting those values, and are connected to a larger group of the Evangelical Immigration Table, which if you have more conservative members of your church that say this is not biblical, there's a whole network of people with World Relief that Matt helped establish. And they are connected to a larger organization of the National Immigration Forum that includes business leaders, businesses, badges, and Bibles, right? Law enforcement, business leaders, and church leaders who are all working together in this sort of centrist to right movement that is much bigger than this office right here or any of us, but to have a sense that we are a part of something bigger, a conversation that's actually reasonable, thoughtful, that wants to move towards solutions that's good for everybody, that has given me great encouragement. So let's continue to be the church while Washington can't figure out what to do. That's the way I think what's happened in 10 years that we've been doing this, 4,000 people have come to find out, to be served in our, let's be the church, and let's love people and see what God does through the church. Didn't answer your question, but that's
That's great. Thank you so much. We just have, it is noon, so if you need to leave, we totally understand. Please feel free to leave. We did get 2 questions that we wanted to address. So this first one says, in your opinions, in these political changing times, what are the things that must stay the same? Programs, mentalities, etc. And what are the things that must change in response for churches, believers, and Christian organizations?
Whose program? There you go.
It doesn't say it doesn't say who it's addressed to. Maybe, I mean, we all have different programs. I think that we run.
Say church programs.
Yeah, churches programs. Yeah. So, what are the things that must stay the same, and what are the things that must change in response?
we might just consider what are the current programs that we have. Where are we already? Where are we already serving as a community? And what are the immigration needs of the populations that we're already serving? So if we do homeless ministry, or if we do a tutoring program, or if we have a partnership with another church, or if we're a part of a larger community, then let's see where we already are. That's what I think. Like, it may not be that you change everything in your church, you just tweak the things that you're doing. Like, you already have mission outreach teams. Maybe you have a community serve you like we do. Well, then talk to David and see how can we support what they're doing and make it one of the things that we do. That's what I think. I think there's probably some tweaking to bring awareness. And change management is really hard in the church. Change equals loss. Okay? Change does not equal growth. So if we thought we were here to grow the church by changing the church, somebody lied to us. Change equals loss. And so we have to be ready for loss. And we have to be ready for some people saying, I don't want to be a part of it. But, so how we lead change incrementally and get the right people on board, like our leadership. And you don't need 60% of the people to be on board. You just need 10% of the people to be on board, who are those early adopters who will support what you're doing. Make sure you cover you are protected. I mean, in terms of the leadership of the church. And so I wouldn't suggest that anybody say, well, let's start a whole new immigration center. It has to have the support, the buy-in of people. And once they do, you said God blesses it, God also gives us joy. And once they have joy in serving a person, you can't stop them from doing it. And so once they start doing that, you go, oh, well, I guess look at the change. So the secret is not that Mike is tutoring children, or Mike is, I don't preach messages on immigration. I'm just championing it now, and I'm watching what people are doing, and I tell their stories. That's my job. So I'm a busy pastor, but I'm a champion for it. I'm not a worker.
I'll just say one thing. I listened to Rebuilders podcast. Mark Sayers talks about geopolitical, social trends and change. And this thing he said the other day was this is a once in every 100 years kind of global shifting, and everything's changing all at once. And it just struck me as a time to also pause and discern what God has for us, because it's easy to rush in and react and be like, oh, we gotta do something. And that's my bent. I mean, I'm like, we're gonna collect furniture. But I think there's also this need to not be reactionary and to really be thoughtful about how we respond to what's changing politically and culturally. And it's going to have major impacts on the church, but that's going to be unfolding. And so what can we do just right now with the resources and influence that we have?
I have just a few thoughts about this question. I think because I've had experience overseas, I was a missionary for 2 years in the developing world, and in a lot of these countries, they don't have social services. It's not institutionalized because they are struggling. And so for me, it's so interesting, even going across the border to our partners in TJ, because it's actually the local church that is doing all of the mercy ministries. They are feeding people, they're sheltering people, they're taking people in from the red light district, they're caring for the orphans, and so it is, because they don't have the social services that we have. So as we see federal funding being taken away, and those kind of social services being shut down, I think it's actually a huge opportunity for the church to step up and bear witness in whatever small way that your church can, and really thinking creatively. There are some churches that we've partnered with, and they're like, we have a classroom on our campus that's empty. And they said, let's turn that into an apartment for somebody who can't afford housing right now. And our church is going to come around that family for a year and walk alongside them and be in the church, And so it's like, they're like, we can't give you the whole building, but we can give you this one little classroom and convert it into something to meet the felt needs in the community. So I encourage you guys to think creatively. Please, did you have something that you want to add? Okay, one last question. It says, what are the financial and advocacy needs for World Relief and pastors in light of federal budget cuts and enforcement? Many. I think many. I think advocacy is huge. Our voices really matter. Whether it's on the ground advocacy and talking about things and bringing things to light. I think as you build a relationship with people that are being impacted, how can you not advocate? How can you not use your voice? Because this is a person that God's brought into your life and that you are loving for a reason. So advocacy, I think, on all levels, on the ground, within your friend circles, and also reaching out to state representatives, to all of our elected officials. And financial needs for World Relief are many. Honestly, I think we have historically relied on federal funding, and we just received news today, this morning, as we're walking in, that all contracts with resettlement agencies have all been canceled for 10 resettlement agencies across the U.S. These are federal contracts that historically we've always had some, even if it's like a trickle of families that we're resettling. And so those contracts have all been canceled. So the future is very uncertain, but there are people here in our community now. I have immigrant pastors that reach out to me regularly and say, will you please pray for us? Our people are so scared, and I'm like, we will pray with you. And we will do Know Your Rights presentations and share all the knowledge and resources that we have.
Yeah, and I'm happy for you to share my email with everybody who signed up to be here. And if there's more conversations you'd like to have, email. I think relying on each other in this time as the body of Christ. If it wasn't for example, Mariners Church in Orange County taking a step before we did, and I can say that's what they're doing. Just the courage. So I think if there's anything we can do to support any of you in your conversations, your congregations, pastors, if they're not here, we'd be happy to do that. We need to rely on each other. We can only be ourselves. I can't be Matt Sorens, but I'm so glad Matt is Matt. and I can be Mike, and I have my own story, and we can be the body of Christ together.
And I think that's it.
Thank you guys so much. Feel free to ask questions.
I just wanted to say something that again, refugees, these people that are afraid and fear, they're people. And God created us all to need each other. And the body of Christ, we see that's how that works in the body of Christ. A lot of these people are very disconnected, and they really need human interaction. And again, you don't have to have training to do that, just to love people. So I think just making yourself available is huge. Yeah.
Thank you guys. Thank you guys for attending. Don't forget to reach out to us with any questions.